Okay, hello friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm here with Bante Sudaso and with Venerable Jagaro, who is currently visiting here at Empty Cloud Monastery from his wandering practice all over the United States. So welcome to Rick Kamasaka, that is watching from Tasmania in Australia. Wonderful. And Jayanta, who is a little bit more close by. Hello, Jayanta. Our neighbor, and hello to the other people that are coming in and haven't checked in quite yet. So whenever you're ready, feel free to type in any questions you might have on Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and we'll try our best to answer your questions. Oh, hello, Mary, also our neighbors, and hello to Maria as well. Welcome.
Maybe we can start by paying homage to the Buddha and then see if any questions come up.
That sounds like a great idea, Bante.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassami.
And hello to Ben from Michigan, Richard Sud, good to see you. Amaranta, hello, Laura. And Richard asks a question. When we meet people and spend some time with them, even briefly, there is a certain sense impression, neutral, positive, or negative, that's left behind after meeting them. Is this memory purely a mental construct, that does it have any karmic attributes from that person, ourselves, or our past lives? Honorable Jagan, would you like to share some reflections?
Boy, honestly, I don't know how to answer that. Let me give me a second.
Okay, maybe when you gather, gather your thoughts, maybe Bante Sudasan, would you like to share some reflections?
Yeah, so, well, first off, there's always some kind of past life impression whenever you meet anyone, because everyone you meet, you've known from past lives. But with some people, that past life impression is going to be very strong. And with most people, it's going to be weak to the point of unnoticeable, and often somewhere in between. So and whatever residue we have from our past life association might be positive, negative, or neutral, so that will impact things. Then there's your, in the present life, whatever habits of mind you have. So maybe you have a tendency to react negatively to people with a certain hairstyle, or with a certain style of glasses, or with a certain facial expression, or whatever. So you might have some kind of automatic reaction, again, positive, negative, or neutral, based upon your present life conditioning. So I would say, it is partially a mental construct from this life, and also partially residue of habits from past lives. So I'd say it's both, and it's not always completely clear what the mixture is. But usually, if you seem to have an irrationally strong reaction to someone on first meeting, and there doesn't seem to be any particularly good explanation for it, it's often residue from past lives. So that's what comes to mind for me off the top of my head.
Yes, I definitely think there's actually probably a lot more than we think or we remember in a lot of the encounters that we have. And definitely it is my experience also that sometimes there are some inexplicable connections with people, kind of like that sense of just that they really understand you, or that the communication is very easy. And with others, instead, there is really strong difficulty in communicating. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with particular abilities that one has in communicating, but there is just like a sort of karmic affinity. Or conversely, non-karmic affinity. And this can also happen with other sentient beings. It can happen with animals, for example. There are some cats or dogs or just foxes or deer or whatever that we might encounter and have that sort of sudden connection. And some others instead that there's like straight away that kind of off sense. So I feel like, usually in non-Buddhist circles, we tend to think of all of these things as a little bit random, or maybe we kind of mythologize it as, talk about, how do you say it? Soulmates. Yeah, soulmates. And I feel like instead, with Buddhism, it makes quite a lot of sense when we talk about, this sort of circular way rather than kind of horizontal way of existence, and where everybody has kind of been our mother and father and sibling and so forth, and friend and partner and etc. And so of course we're going to have actually more than just one non-soulmate. And also a lot of kind of perhaps people that we had some beef, in the past with. And it really depends on maybe how close this sort of experience has happened. And so actually when we look at things through the lenses of past lives, everything makes a lot more sense. And yeah, it's not just bizarre and weird. Right, but there's lots of other questions that are popping in the meanwhile. So maybe let's go to the next one. How do we determine what are emotional needs versus what are emotional wants?
Venerable is looking at me. It's interesting. Is a question. I recall recently I was visiting a friend in Boston, and his partner, she asked, or she was actually kind of talking out loud about not quite this question, but very similar in terms of what's a need versus a want. And I remember, many weeks later, actually reflecting on this question. And so I'll try to answer this one because this is about emotional needs and emotional wants. And the previous question was more just needs and wants. So as human beings, or actually many animals as well, there are a lot of things that if we don't have, we have trouble surviving, getting along, finding some sort of ease or comfort. Of course, things like breathing, for example, that's probably the most pressing need. If we don't breathe, then we maybe 5-10 minutes, and that's pretty much it for us. And there's other more similar physical material wants like water and some sort of food or sustenance. And those are more material. And of course, on the emotional side, I think it was what you're getting at. If, for example, a young child, a baby, can't connect with some sort of adult figure or some sort of caring figure in their life, they don't do well. In fact, I think it's not uncommon for them to even go so as far as to pass away after some amount of time. And so having some sort of connection, we can just see, not just using Buddhism, just on a very practical level. We clearly we're not going to do very well if we don't have these things. And so I think it's so the question is, how do we determine what are needs versus wants? So I think what this kind of question is getting at is that we may have a desire, or something we're feeling, or something that's going on inside, and it's a yearning for something. It's maybe it is wanting connection with others, maybe it's wanting some sort of of respect from others. Maybe it's wanting a sense of being loved. And I'm not a psychologist, but my guess is pretty much most people, we have a hard time if we don't get these things from some way or the other. In order to kind of tease this out, I think one thing to do, and I think is you're asking questions, right? So you're doing it right now. You're getting kind of advice for others. But also, it's also really important. And I don't want to say more important, but I think it's really essential to actually understand what it actually is. What is the desire? What's the thing? Because one of the things that tends to happen with a desire is that sometimes our desires, especially in the emotional areas, maybe it says, oh, I want this or want that, but it often can be kind of camouflaging something that kind of that's something more substantial. And meditation, or just honestly just being willing to be quiet and asking yourself these questions, is actually really important. And it's not going to come, it might come, you just immediately ask, but it's really important to have the space and time to be by yourself alone to ask these questions. And I think that can help us to discern, what's actually important for us. So I don't know if the Venerables want anything to add to that, but that's what comes to mind.
Thank you, Venerable. Yeah, another thing that comes to mind actually is just really paying also attention to the physical sensations of the emotions, the Vedana that comes actually whenever we're experiencing any type of emotion, can actually be very informative and really kind of pointing us towards the direction of really finding the answer, whether it's a need or a want, so to speak. So really watching our minds. If we can get very intellectual and in our heads about emotions and start nurturing the story. But our physical reaction, whenever there is the physical component of our emotions, in my experience, seems to have a little bit more kind of honesty, more truthfulness to the actual experience. And so there's sometimes there can be we can be in an environment that it's extremely challenging, right? Where there's perhaps a lot of, it's very difficult to navigate if we are experiencing perhaps even different forms of discrimination or oppression or whatnot. And in those cases, we need to really understand whether that challenge, for example, is something that can be good for making progress in the path, or if that challenge is actually a little bit too much. And actually, it's a challenge that is making us backslide. And maybe we actually just we really need to get out of there, rather than, focusing too much on like, oh, I really want, to be appreciated. I really want, we were talking about the worldly gains last night, actually. So praise and blame, we can get a little bit too much on spiritually bypassing ourselves, going like, oh yeah, because, I just like to be praised and I don't like blame. So, here everybody's blaming me, or everybody's saying X, Y, and Z. And so, okay, I just have to, as a good Buddhist, I have to just be here and endure. And I feel like in those situations, for example, if we actually pay attention to the sort of, physical component, it's just really not, perhaps not the healthiest place where to be. And so we can go like, actually, I need to be in a place that it's a little bit more supportive for my practice, a little bit, more conducive to developing qualities of mind. And in that way, we kind of can answer for ourselves that right now that sort of emotional desire, that emotion is telling us of something that we need. And some others, we just can't bear, it's actually very difficult, for example, to live in community. Sometimes people are just really annoying and we're doing annoying things, or we're just annoyed for no reason. So we just want to get the hell out of there. And it's a little bit different, I don't like this, I don't want this has to stop. It's more of an emotional want. That's vibhava tanha, essentially. That's I don't want to experience this, or rather I want to experience something else. Bhava tanha is an entirely different experience. And sometimes we can get a little bit confused with the two if we just if we start playing the narrative in our minds and get too intellectual. So personally, it's helpful for me to ground myself in the body, and that kind of gives me a little bit more information. And and then I'm kind of like, all right, ayasoma, now you're just being a little bit obnoxious and you just don't like this, or oh, this is really painful, this is actually not supportive. So a little bit different. And if you have any other, okay, then we'll pass you the other question, Bante. That's all right. One hell of a guy asks, or one hull of a guy, which actually is different from hell. Many teachers talk about using samadhi to develop strong sati, and then upon emerging from samadhi, doing, for example, body contemplation. Does this mean we really should only focus on developing samatha in our practice till we can reliably obtain upachara samadhi and hold off on body contemplation until then? Or should we develop both simultaneously? If so, how should we split our time between the two?
Well, and I would refer back to the Yogananda Sutta, because in the Yogananda Sutta, the Buddha clearly lays out 4 different strategies to meditation practice. And one of them is to start by focusing on developing samadhi. And then after one samadhi is developed to a certain point, then one practices vipassana. The second strategy is to start with vipassana. And then after practicing vipassana for a while, then to focus on building up one samadhi. And the third strategy is to develop both samatha and vipassana simultaneously. And then the fourth strategy is subject to a lot of debate, so I won't go into it right now. But the first 3 are the ones that are most relevant to your question. So the strategy that you describe in your question matches closely with the first of the 3 that the Buddha gives. And throughout Buddhist history, this has usually been the most commonly taught approach to meditation, and it seems to work pretty well for a lot of people. Probably the second most commonly taught is to the simultaneous development approach, which was particularly popular in the Chan schools of Buddhism. The approach of using vipassana first and later developing samadhi has usually been the least common of the 3, but for some people it's the most effective approach. So there's no one single approach which is universally good for absolutely everyone, which is why the Buddha gives us a wide variety of options, is because each person will have their own particular needs and affinities when it comes to meditation practice. So as far as what to develop and how to divide your time, well, you need to experiment with your own mind and figure out what works for you. So I get very good results from starting with developing samadhi, and then once the samadhi is well established, then doing other practices. I've also had good results with doing simultaneous samadhi and vipassana, but usually after my samadhi is already cultivated to some degree. But I've had some success with simultaneous practice as well. And I know other people who have had success with starting with vipassana practice and only later coming to focus on samadhi. So you really need to investigate your own mind and figure out which of these 3 approaches is going to be most effective for you.
Great, thank you, Bante. And Rick asks, can you speak about the experience of transitioning from first to second jhana? Tanjagaro, you've just come out of from a 2-month retreat, so maybe you'd like to answer this?
Actually, I'll just simply say I don't have the experience of transition from first, second jhana. The venerables would.
Well,
first off,
there's a precept that
there are ways of talking without breaking precepts. Anyway, so the critical distinction between first and second jhana is that in first jhana there's still vitakka and vichara, in second jhana there is not. So where this comes down to some room for interpretation is about what exactly vitakka and vichara mean. So the literal meaning of these words is thought and movement. Vitakka means thought and vichara means movement. That's what these words literally mean. So in first jhana, there's still some degree of mental activity going on. And in second jhana, that's completely gone. So this is the critical difference. So there can still be a little bit of background noise and tremors to the mind in first jhana. But in second jhana, the mind becomes completely silent and still. So that's the critical difference.
Great. Thank you, Bhante. And Kamasaka has a great question for Tanjaga.
It's a great question, too.
We observe the law being broken, specifically youths riding motorcycles illegally on public roads, performing wheel stands, and without helmets. Do we let it be or report to authorities?
This sounds awfully detailed and specific.
This is interesting.
This may not be a hypothetical question.
I have a friend.
One of the things that reading the text that I see the Buddha pointing to very frequently is understanding in our hearts, what's going on with respect to greed, hatred, and delusion. In other words, are we motivated by greed? Are we motivated by hatred? Are we motivated by delusion? Or alternatively, are we motivated by non-greed, which is, can be things like, kind of generosity or kind of helping out, hatred, non-hatred, which can be kindness or a loving or a wish to protect or to care for, or non-delusion, which is, of course, it probably more sensibly is considered, clarity and wisdom or experience. And so I would encourage Kamasaka or whoever is observing this to see in one's own mind or heart what's going on. What in other words, kind of, okay, maybe you are, let's say, motivated to report, okay, and just see what's going on there. Is it what's motivating that, or something? Maybe you're motivated to not to, or maybe it's a combination of two. What are the different movements going on? And that will help you, inform you about what the appropriate path is. And of course, the Buddha is always consistently recommending non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion.
Great. Thank you, Venerable. And one hull of a guy, maybe Bhante, since you've been talking about the subject, you can elaborate on this. It feels like the pathway for deepening samadhi and the pathway for entering a kind of spaced out mind state are very similar in that both involve absorbing deeper into our meditation object. How do we make sure that we develop the first without falling into the second?
Well, first off, I think it's actually very dangerous to talk about samadhi practice as absorbing into an object, because that will actually lead to you, well, one, either falling asleep or spacing out. So I think talking about absorbing into a meditation object is already indicating that you're going in the wrong direction. Rather, samadhi practice can better be understood as the mind becoming incredibly still and incredibly alert. So these are the critical qualities of samadhi: stillness and alertness. Whereas my memories of spacing out are that the mind is kind of drifting and hazy. So it's not actually completely still, and it's definitely not alert. So if you want a way of measuring samadhi development, samadhi is the development of samadhi can be measured by the mind becoming increasingly still and increasingly alert, and this should be happening in tandem. So if the mind is becoming still but less alert, well, that's called falling asleep, and it's not particularly useful. If the mind is becoming increasingly alert but not still, well, that's called an anxiety attack, which also is not particularly helpful. So what we want is the mind to be becoming simultaneously more still and more alert. So this is actually how to distinguish between the two and to make sure you're going in the right direction.
Great, thank you, Bante. And Sud asks, does the Buddha recommend any techniques to overcome irrational fears in our lives, like fear of the dark or fear of ghosts, for example? Actually, there's a sutta specifically where the Buddha talks about overcoming fear, and he suggests developing the 5 powers. And interestingly enough, like one of the 5 powers is saddha, developing faith. And it's also what we, for example, read in all the biographies of all the incredible Thai masters Thai forest masters that definitely were having a lot of experiences with ghosts and so forth, and a lot of fear in the forest. And actually, I remember when I first read them, there was always, like also Ajahn Chah's biography. There's the Itipiso that they would constantly do the recollections of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and that would be very supportive of eliminating this or getting out of this state of fear. So very, very interesting. Personally, not being a faith type necessarily. That was not my entry point within Buddhism, but being someone who is constantly actively developing faith and developing saddha intentionally, actually. I do find it that the more my saddha becomes developed, the more like a lot of irrational fears are somewhat just fading away. So this is what comes to mind. I don't know if the other venerables have other thoughts.
One of the things that came to mind was, the sutta, sometimes the Buddha included fear as one of, I don't want to say hindrance, but as a kind of obstruction to the path. And other times, and I don't know if this is a language thing, that, fear is often talked about, like, for example, the fear of, let's say, committing a bad act, for example, an act that leads to harm, is actually something to, not to, get rid of. It's actually very necessary that, and so maybe one suggestion or another way of looking at this is maybe instead of separating, kind of creating a split between irrational fears, maybe thinking about, or is this fear obstructing me from well-being and happiness, or is this fear, actually trying to help, with my overall well-being, happiness, and practicing the Buddhist path? Because one of the cautions I have around, like, I'm assuming this is because culturally, often people say rational fear is good, irrational fear is bad, or something like that. I'm not saying this what you're saying, but often I hear things like that. The thing is that sometimes we may have a fear, and it may not be able to articulate itself, right? It may not have a rationality around it, but actually might be quite helpful. It's trying to help us out. Well, the fears we have, yeah, I mean, let's say, fear of ghosts or fear of the dark. I mean, all these fears come from, millions, whatever years of who knows what. And it's trying to help in some way. Sometimes it's not helpful, but sometimes it is. We're just not, or we're not aware of it. So I just want to encourage you to maybe try to shift your, maybe look at fear with a different kind of dichotomy. Instead of using irrational and rational fears, maybe instead use fears that are obstructive or fears that actually are trying to help us.
Great, thank you, Bante. And Skeptic says, do you have knowledge about the Santi Asokan sect in Thailand?
Sect, maybe?
They built a socialist community. Interesting. I do not know. Do you?
Yeah,
No?
I don't know anything about it.
We'll check it out. Thanks for the inspiration. And Catherine asks, are all devas Buddhist? Can they directly see rebirth and karma? Well, I think the devas in Italy are not really very Buddhist. There's, I think they're kind of like humans, there is some are Buddhist, some are not. Some are more deluded than others. Some, have been there for a long, long time, so they can't see rebirth at all. And actually, perhaps they think they have created everything. They might be a little bit delirious, and so it's not terribly different, I would say, than the human realm. It's just a little bit more pleasant. So that's my perspective. Not sure if the venerables. Yeah, I think the devas in Asia are a little bit more Buddhist.
Realistically, I think most devas are just focused on partying all the time. And so they're not particularly concerned with remembering their past lives or practicing Buddhism. They're just concerned with enjoying their nice lives.
Yeah, anyway, one thing that I think I said it already in a live stream, but I found really cute when I went to Italy and I was talking to this other actually Buddhist monk, and he was telling me that he was having these conversations with some Catholic nuns, and they were actually encouraging all of us to communicate a little bit more with the devas. We can call them angels, perhaps, in the Catholic tradition, and specifically the guardian angel. So her perspective, the nun's perspective, was that we actually need to give work to the guardian angel. So literally, go hey, guardian angel, can you speak to Tanjagaro's guardian angel and convince him to stay at Empty Cloud for his benefit and the benefit of others? For example. Things like that of course are not selfish. If we have a right intention, then the devas, the guardian angels will be more kind of in tune, and so then they will also be happier, and we'll have better, more cordial relationships with them. Some food for thought. This was thanks to Bante Mittananda from Italy. And Tajveer is asking, hello venerables, would it be possible for you to comment on how to see dependent origination? Oh, just a little a little question. Bante Sudasa?
Well, the short answer is to observe the process of causality in your daily life. So observe the cause and effect relationship, that it's actually visible in every moment. In every moment, you can see how causes have effects, effects have causes, and the surrounding conditions for something affect how that result comes into being. So just observe the process of causality in your everyday life, because fundamentally, Paticca Samuppada is just an elaboration on the basic principle of causality. In fact, the Buddha summarized Paccittisamuppada as when this is, that is. When this ceases, that ceases. So very simple summary. So pointing out how there's always a cause-effect relationship between things. Yeah, so that's the short answer.
Sadhu. Something?
One of the things I think is very helpful about trying to pay attention to these cause and effect relationships or these in our experience is that it can, there's a sort of a deeper experience of this, but just on a, when you're just starting, one of the things that I found when I just, started on like a more superficial level is that can really help, how do I say, like cut away a lot of the, if the mind's kind of, how do you say, wrapped up in personality and like, identity and this person and that person and this person did this and I did that kind of stuff. It really starts to help see experience as more of, well, more in terms of not getting caught up in that kind of thinking. And so now, the Buddha taught dependent origination. It's very profound and very deep, but you can always, that's what I found but quite helpful when I just started that, is like, oh wow, this like, it's not even a meditation, just trying to observe, make connections of how, how it seems like, oh yeah, my mind's more oriented now towards cause and effect relationships, not paying attention to personalities as much.
Thank you, Venerables. Yeah, I would just add, to that, it's very helpful then to stop also taking ourselves too seriously, in the sense that there is, that, especially when we were talking about earlier about emotions, we can tend to very much identify with I am this, I am that. And instead, when we actually start understanding that all of these emotions are dependently arisen, then we can understand that instead of focusing on the effects, so what is there, and identifying with the effects, we can actually focus on the causes and conditions that create those effects. And so if we don't like what we're currently experiencing, if we don't like, for example, anger arising in the mind, and we don't like greed arising in the mind, and we don't like delusion arising in the mind, then instead of going, oh, I'm such a hateful person, or I'm such a greedy person, or I'm such a delusional person, instead we can actually focus more on creating different causes and conditions that will have different effects. And this essentially is, it's what empowers us so much about the teachings of the Buddha, that really we're like, okay, actually, it doesn't have to be this way. I don't have to deal with Yasoma 24/7 in the way she is right now. Like, okay, there's still some vipaka, still some results of previous actions. But yeah, planting better seeds, then we'll have better results. And one hell of a guy.
Lots of great questions.
Yeah, has many questions.
I'm waiting for somebody else to change their handle to one, like something else. I don't know. I don't want to play with this, but sorry, I won't say anything.
So they ask, can you clarify the difference between the third and fourth satipatthanas? I see that.
I'm very interested in
your
Venerable
perspective.
Jagoro's answer. I get this question all the time, so I know what I would say, but I want to know what you would say.
Right. So this is the basically the base of what do you call it, mind or chitta, and the base of Dhamma. My mem, gosh, I'm trying to remember the Satipatthana Sutta, or the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So I'll just tell you how I haven't spent too much time formally practicing with this, so I'll just tell you what has. I'm not saying so. Big asterisks. Please. This is how do you say? Please take this with a very lightly. But my experience with using the kind of chitta is that what you're doing is you're going, okay, the mind is he lists out a few different kind of states. I can't remember what they all are, but you're basically being mindful. Okay, the mind is in this state. Okay, the mind's in that state. Okay, mind is this way. Mind is that way. Right. And the base of Dhammas is more about trying to remember. It's more about seeing, or how do you say, being. It's a good question. I'm thinking about it. It's very similar. It's a really good question. It's funny. It's like I'm starting to like, wow. Yeah.
Well, we asked this specific question also to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi recently.
Yeah.
So it is one of those like kind of frequently asked questions also within monastic circles. Maybe Bhante, do you want to share Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's answer on the matter, which was very elucidating?
Well, so now that I've thought about this more, I'm like, wow, this is a really good question. Yeah. Please, I'd like to hear your answer.
Which is why we asked it to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Yeah.
And his answer, as I recall, was that the fourth satipatthana is more about the mental experience of different categories of phenomena. So the experience of the five hindrances, the experience of the seven enlightenment factors, the experience of the khandhas, but as a mental experience. So as a mental phenomenon, whereas the Chittanupassana is more about, as you were saying, the state of the mind, like the current condition of the mind. So
Venerable, can you rephrase that? When you're saying like the experience, how is that different than the state? What is that? What is that focusing on? Like kind of like the qualities of it?
So the state of the mind would be like, is the mind distracted or is it focused? Is the mind lustful or is it lust-free? So it's more the condition of the mind. Is the mind expansive or constricted? So more the condition of the mind. So then with an expansive mind, you could be contemplating the five hindrances, or with a constricted mind, you could be contemplating the five hindrances. But observing the five hindrances would be in the fourth satipatthana. Whereas recognizing whether the mind is expansive or constricted would be in the domain of the third.
Oh, okay. I think I understand what you're saying now. It's like it's very specific to those things, those dhammas. Okay.
But there is also some overlap.
I see.
So this is with the four satipatthanas, we talk about them as four separate things, but there's a certain amount of overlap between the four categories. So they're not, the lines between them are not as sharply drawn as one might hope for.
Right. So he was also drawing the parallel between the five aggregates, correct? And like where, for example, there's the Rupakanda, and how that is different though when you're actually contemplating doing mindfulness of the body, actually like the first satipatthana of contemplating the body, even when you're doing the four elements meditation and so forth, where that's just also only focusing on that aspect of the experience, as opposed to in the Dhammas, then you're taking that within the context of the five aggregates rather than just exploring, using that way, that entry point for.
Got it. So if my understanding correctly, the base of Dhamma, you're trying to keep the context in mind, not just knowing the state as it goes from one to the other. Is that my understanding? Did I get that right?
That was my understanding of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's framework.
I think we both took away somewhat different pieces to his
Okay.
answer, because any Dhamma answer also lands differently in different minds.
Right.
So
Okay.
what I got from his description of the difference between the Rupa Kanda as part of the fourth Satipatthana and Rupa as the base of the first Satipatthana is that in the first one, you're just trying to get this direct experience of the body, this direct experience of physicality. Whereas the fourth one is observing the mental experience of physicality.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I think we're all
Maybe we're saying the
we're
same
saying
thing, but in
the
different
same
ways.
thing. Yes.
Okay. That actually, what you just, Venerable, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
He's a lot more eloquent.
Yeah.
I was trying to say that.
Would it be fair to say that the fourth base, or the base of Dhamma, is more like trying to, I mean, how do you say this? Like, because you use the word kind of direct, like the kind of in the third base, the base of Chitta, are we, because we have all these signs, I often call them nimittas, but signs, but just kind of like that kind of mental, what are we, I don't know what to call it, what we just call nimitta. It's these things that are help us recognize, oh, this is, like I said, this is a sense of, like you said, kind of expansiveness, or there's a sense of kind of constrictiveness. And the third base is more, even though that nimitta may be there, we're more trying to just know, okay, this is what the mind is. And the fourth one is actually paying more attention to the actual, that almost, you're almost like paying more attention to the nimitta. Is that what you're kind of saying? Or
I think it's a bit like the difference between Vedana and Sanya. So when you have a sensory experience, Vedana is just that kind of like basic, like animalistic feeling
right.
of, but then Sanya is when we get into identifying what it is, and Sankara, we get into like conceptualizing about it and so on.
Okay.
So similarly, like Chittanupassana is, in my mind, it's more analogous to Vedana. It's more just like the basic felt sense of what condition the mind is in right now, the current mental state or mental condition.
The Chitta or Dhamma?
Chitta.
Oh, Chitta. Okay.
And then Dhammanupassana is more like Sanya and Sankara. That more when we start getting into like fleshing out an object and conceptualizing about an object, and naming and labeling and ruminating about an object.
Excellent. It's turning into monk
chatting with
That was good. That was a good question.
And actually, we could probably spend hours just talking about that one question, because there's a lot to go on.
Yeah, to be continued. We'll also ask John Bramali when he's here.
Oh, yes. Yeah, good idea.
And Rick asks, how do we maintain our joy and peace when going through financially difficult times? I mean, realistically speaking, you're probably not going to maintain your joy and peace when going through financially difficult times until there's, some sort of level of awakening, I actually think. Because fundamentally, that's, the state of, it's precisely what we were talking about last night. We're all, there's that. Even though intellectually we understand that our wealth is impermanent, we just take it as permanent. And then when that disappears, when impermanence manifests, we take that also as permanent, not thinking that is impermanent. So it's that process. It will just start just by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. It will start stinging less and less. And it's constant, financially difficult times. So if we take also like our gain, our financial gains as also difficult times in the sense that they're precarious, then we can start understanding a little bit more that sometimes sometimes there's gain, sometimes there's not. It's kind of like going Pindapata. Sometimes there's food, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's lots of bread. I remember there were those days where we would have like huge quantities of bread in Italy. And then those other days, like where we had zero bread and we were really like, we really needed some bread. Like, wow. Like all that bread, like.
This is an Italian ceremony bread.
Well, as we were walking, 25 kilometers at least a day. So like the bread was really like good sustenance, but sometimes it was just too much. And like we can't store food. So it's not that we could store it for the days that we didn't have. So I feel like that's also like that practice, also as lay people, Buddhist lay people can also take in a little bit of that mentality. Obviously, it's so much easier to practice as a monastic because once we practice with the Vinaya, we really have that understanding. So we're like, okay, well, sometimes we have lots of bread and sometimes we don't have any bread at all. And, the very beginning, there will be actually a lot of greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind, like, oh, I want the bread so much. Gonna die without the bread. This is horrible. Oh, I have the bread. Oh, this is great. Yes, finally. And then and then we stop taking it as seriously. So it's part of the practice of like, oh, okay, now there's bread, now there's not bread, now there's the unpleasant feeling, now there's the neutral feeling, now there's the pleasant feeling, and it's just dukkha that rises and dukkha that ceases, and then it becomes a little bit more peaceful, less suffering. But it's a process. But we can't expect, okay, like it's not a pill. The Dhamma is not a pill, unfortunately. They're like, okay, pill. Oh, joy and happiness. I lost everything. Great. It doesn't work that way.
Can I add maybe
Please.
one thing to this? I don't know if you are currently in a financially difficult time, and what question is asked, or if it's you might be foreseeing that, and the Venerable's answer I think is really great. If you're foreseeing, hey, right now I'm doing well, but it might not do well in the future. On the other hand, if you are currently experiencing financial difficulties right now, like, wow, this really is not. Oh, yeah, this is a lot of dukkha. There's a lot of pain. This is really frustrating. One thing I found helpful, not necessarily in this domain, but in other domains where is to actually to widen one's gaze. And what I mean by that is to ask oneself, am I the only person that is experiencing this? And usually, well, especially with something like financially difficult, it's not. And one thing that I found really helpful is whenever we're, if we have the, I don't know if, like I used to, as a layperson, take public transportation all the time. And so there's just lots of people around, the buses or the trains or whatever. I mean, there's, a lot of people are experiencing, and you just look at, it's like, you can just, oh, wow, I can tell this person over here is probably experiencing a lot of financial difficulty, and that person over there, like, oh, I'm not the only person experiencing this. And then also, so that's, I think, can help with the peace aspect. And with the joy, one of the things that came to my mind was one of the, I can't remember the exact way that the Buddha put it, but so Venerables, please correct me. But basically, he said, if people knew what I knew about the benefits of giving, they would not go one meal without sharing some of it. Mm-hmm. And to me, that there's something about that teaching. Whenever I remember and think about it, it's like, wow. I mean, the Buddha's saying something there, right? He's like saying, hey, there's something really important about sharing, and one can always do that, even in the most trying circumstances. So, and that whenever we can share that, when I've experienced this, it's such a brightening experience. So I would encourage you to give it a try.
Excellent. Thank you, Venerable. And Richard asks, Dear Aya, I'm trying to recall if you mentioned Aya Kema in her book, Being Nobody, Going Nowhere. If yes, thank you so much. Her Dhamma talks and teachings have been life-changing for me. She explains the Dhamma with such clarity that penetrates the mind directly and gently. I'm actually really embarrassed to say that I never read one single book of Aya Kema's, but I did put it on the wish list of Empty Cloud Monastery, and actually all her books, and they were all purchased, and they're currently in the library. And I have that aspiration of reading them. I just haven't come to it. Even someone that I met was looking at me like appalled.
That's a good one.
The title's particularly good. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember reading it many years ago and quite liking it as well. Good book.
All right, maybe I'll pick it up tomorrow.
You'll pick it up and put it on your pile of other books.
Just recommend.
I do have, I'm known to have piles of books in my room that I move from room to room.
Without reading in any of those rooms.
It's true. Have you read it, Bante? Okay.
You've read it.
Okay.
Yeah. Good book. Yeah. Yeah. Good
Great.
book. Okay.
So Ben says, when the Buddha talks about practicing sense restraint, he says not to get caught up in the signs and features. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Well, first off, the Pali words here are not nimittagahi, not vyanjanagahi. So the important words to know here are nimitta, vyanjana, and gahi. So gahi means literally to grab at. And nimitta, its most basic meaning is an object of attention. So any perceptual object, anything within our perceptual field. And vyanjana has the meaning of characteristic or detail. So what the Buddha is talking about here is not to fixate on the details of whatever's in our field of awareness. And this is particularly relevant to anything which is provocative of desire or aversion. So for example, if you're walking through the streets of Paris and it's in the afternoon and you have the precept of not eating after noon and you see, ooh, there's a boulangerie across the street, then that's your clue to practice sense restraint, which in this case means not staring lustfully at those incredible pastries through the window. In fact, you might want to avert your gaze away from the bakery as you walk past.
This is an incredibly detailed.
This
Might be a true story.
Yeah, this might not be a hypothetical scenario. Or similarly, if you see somebody and you know that it's someone who you just hate the hell out of and that they always do the most annoying things, well, direct your attention somewhere else. Don't fixate on the details of all the things you hate about that person. Because if you do, it will just provoke the dosa in your mind. So that's what the Buddha is talking about. It's about not fixating on the defilement-provoking details of a sensory experience.
Excellent. Well said. Great.
And I can't deny those French bakeries or something else, though.
Yeah. Croissants layered really well. They're also very aesthetically pleasing. You know, it's like perfect. Mara really did well on that one.
Yeah. And there's like one on every block.
Yes.
It's like walking through Paris is like walking through a minefield.
That's right. And Manal says, can samadhi, alertness plus stillness, be experienced in the wake state? Anybody wants to take this question?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like that's actually the only state where you can experience it. You can only experience it when you're awake.
I almost want to maybe she can rephrase the question or something. Maybe something, a word got lost. Or...
Yeah, or maybe they mean something other than what we think they do by wake state.
I mean the woke state.
The woke?
I think if you have Manal specific details, feel free to share. And Tejveer says, could you please explain how Namarupa, which has Passa as its constituent, results in Passa later on independent origination? Can Namarupa be understood as a phenomenon?
Are you going to assign this to someone?
Bante,
Okay.
please go away. Not go away, sorry, go ahead. My English after a few months in Italy has gone away. Sorry.
She's become bilingual.
Yes, exactly.
So, well, to be honest, I usually think of nama rupa in Paticca as meaning the basic arising of an experience of body and mind, and in particular, it's a body and mind on which there's attached some kind of identity. But it's on its most basic form, it's just the arising of the experience of body and mind. But it's the details of that body-mind experience are something that emerge later. So first it's like, okay, what am I? Oh, I'm this body-mind. Well, what is this body-mind? Oh, well, it has 6 senses. Well, what are these 6 senses experiencing? Oh, they're experiencing sense contact. So it's kind of like getting more and more fixated on the details of our experience. A bit like how initially you see a blurry image, but as you focus in on it, you can see increasing levels of detail and refinement. So that's also what one of the things that I see in Paticca is that it's starting from the most basic level of blurriness, which is avijja. So avijja is like this opaque, dense fog, this blurriness. And then we start refining that blurriness. Like, what's in this blurriness? Oh, there's objects in this blurriness. Sankharas, objects. Oh, when I'm aware of these objects, that's vijnana, that's consciousness. And what is it that's me in all of this mess? Oh, it's mind and body. Well, what is this mind and body? Oh, it's these 6 senses. And so it's kind of this increasing clarity in the blurriness. And unfortunately, it usually winds up in us making a bunch of desire and aversion and dukkha in the end. So that's usually how I relate to it, as nama rupa here is not necessarily phassa, as you're mentioning, because that does come later in the sequence, but rather a more basic, undefined experience of body-mind. But that's just my own way of relating to it. I'm wondering if one of the other venerables has a different way of thinking about this.
I don't know if this is correct, but normally I tend to think of, avijja, basically, essentially, since it's the cause of this like predicament of never-ending dukkha. So to clearly be at the very beginning and for it to create sankhara, I always think of it in terms of like the conditions that come from the avijja. So basically the ignorance of how things are then creates the conditions for essentially having an experience of something, which is vijnana. And that creates an experience of mind and body even being 2 different things, 2 kind of distinct things, which then allows us to have an experience of the world with the 6 senses, essentially. So both essentially with the physical part of our experience and with the mental part of the experience of both nama and rupa basically start becoming 3D in a way. And then that creates the contact with that then has all different layers of vedana and attachment, etc. And this whole mess of dukkha that keeps generating more avijja, creating more ignorance and more conditions and so forth. But this has been the way that, like, reflecting on kind of my experience, this has made sense. But I don't know if it's correct or it's just more avijja. No, Bhante, you have anything you would like to add?
The question I think is coming in my mind is it's almost I wanted a follow-up question to Tejveer. Tejveer? I don't know that.
Oh, I pronounced Tejveer, but
Tejveer, no. It's can nama be understood as a phenomenon? I guess I don't understand quite what you mean by that second question. I think maybe if you can rephrase that question and ask it again. That's the one I'm not quite understanding what you're trying to get at. Unless either you know what he's.
No,
Yeah.
if you want to follow up, Tashbir, you're welcome to. And Maria says, hello, Tam Jagaro, nice to see you.
Oh,
So Moria, it's actually not
Moria.
Maria. So
Moria.
right now,
Do you know a Moria?
I believe I do. I don't know if it's the same Moria that I'm thinking about, but if it is, then hello, Moria.
Great. And you have also another fan, Charles Lee, our friend.
Oh, pleasure to meet you.
And Andres says, hello, I hope you're all doing well. Well, all right. Thank you very much, Andres. I'm new to an investigation of Buddhism, and my question is there any evidence for rebirth? Thank you for your answer. Venerable, would you like to take this, or?
It depends what you mean by evidence. So, oh boy, this is something I think is like usually when people say evidence, they mean like either like evidence, they mean like a courtroom, or more kind of like evidence. That's one kind of area of evidence. There's evidence of like, is there some sort of like material thing I can point to, right? Or is there something that I can look at or reproduce? And so my understanding of I haven't actually looked into this, so I don't know one way or the other, but my understanding there are some studies that tried to kind of anecdotally put together like stories of children and their experiences having memories that are hard to explain, right? Try to understand like how do you have these memories, and sometimes they connect it to actual real kind of experiences that may have happened in the past. The thing about this is that this probably, well, this not probably, it doesn't really quite count in kind of like a what would typically be considered like a science form of evidence. But it is something, there are some interesting stories. I remember hearing a few of them. One of the things I think is helpful, I think maybe what this question may be asking is, maybe they hear about rebirth and they're like, well, that, like there's a lot of parts about Buddhism. I heard this from many people. There's a lot of parts of Buddhism I like, I like meditation, I like the teachings, but some like this rebirth thing, I don't know what it is. And so often you'll hear people say one thing, it's like, well, it's clearly evident, right? Or other people that say, well, you don't need to think about it, just put it to the side, right? Or so you'll hear these kind of pat answers from people. Maybe one way that can be, or not. One other pat answer is, if you just keep meditating long enough and you develop the meditation and the power to experience past lives, then you'll answer. But I feel like a lot of these things are kind of sort of saying, kind of, I don't know, pushing away. I think what you're really getting at, and I think what you're getting at, is that you have doubt. And that's not necessarily, so that doubt is something that maybe I would ask you, like it's good. On one level, it's good that you're asking this question because you're saying, hey, can I resolve this doubt? But suppose, so maybe I'll ask this, suppose you did have evidence of rebirth, right? Suppose there was. Then if you have that evidence, would that satisfy that doubt? And I'm putting that as kind of a query for Andres, and to try to understand and see what what's driving you to ask this question. And I'm not, this is a kind of a guess on my part that it's doubt. Maybe it's something else. But to try to understand where is this kind of question coming from, I wouldn't. So I don't know if that helps, and maybe there's a follow-up question from Andres, but that's kind of what comes to my mind. I don't know if the Venerables have something. want to
Great,
say.
thank you. I would say any evidence for rebirth? Yes, my entire experience of reality. I mean, I used to like work in fashion in Italy, for example, and now I'm a Buddhist monk in the United States, like two completely like different realms of experience. Just I kind of remember it. But now that I'm going back to Italy and sometimes going into those universes, I'm like, wow, whoa, I remember actually being here. What a really weird like realm of existence that was. So yeah, there is, do I remember the person that was there? Yes, I do remember. Do I see the cause and consequence, the effects basically of the karma that I did in the past, and now my experience has retributions and consequences? Yes, absolutely. Am I the same person that I was before? Absolutely not. Then the other thing is Western science, aside from forget about Buddhism, forget about everything, but actually Western science alone tells us that this body is constantly in a process of rebirth. It's constantly, there's matter that ceases and matter that rises. So literally the body that I had, in Milan when I was working there and having my particular experience of rebirth there was even radically different than the body that is currently present here. So yeah, like it's just that we tend to think there's that sort of sense of continuity, but fundamentally it's just constantly rebirth, 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 rebirth. And then we decide that arbitrarily there is like something that we call birth, which by the way, nobody remembers. No one ever remembers when we were born. So that we take out of faith that we were born that day at that time in that hospital or possibly house or whatever. And then there is that moment of death that we kind of know that we're going to die, but nobody, us who are quote unquote alive, really believes that. We have that sense of immortality, which is why we're always shocked when someone that we care about dies. We're like, oh, wait, I thought you were immortal, There's that sense. So I feel like when we actually start investigating our experience, then that's where we actually really see the evidence of rebirth. And we see the evidence of our distortion of reality. We see the evidence of our vipalasam, of taking the impermanent as permanent, the the impersonal as personal, and the suffering as pleasurable. So we just got it all wrong, and we really believe in this wrong experience of reality, which is avijja pachaya sankhara, essentially connected to the answer before.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, what comes to mind for me is that when we look at our experience, so what we see is a continuous chain of moments of experience linked together by cause and effect. And this is actually what has been going on for as long as we can remember. We've never actually seen anything else except for this continuous, seemingly unbroken chain of interrelated moments shaped by cause and effect, by decision and consequence. And so to me, what actually takes an incredible amount of faith is to believe that this being spontaneously popped into existence a few decades ago and will spontaneously cease to exist at some undefined point in the future. So our experience has been of a continuous, unbroken chain of moments. To believe that that chain started out of nothing and will eventually end for no apparent reason, that to me takes a tremendous amount of faith. But on the other hand, to suspect that this experience of a continuum of interrelated moments has been going on for who knows how long and will continue for who knows how long, that's actually completely in line with what we actually experience. And And if you also want to get into the question of proof of rebirth, actually one of the ways of approaching it is through intellectual analysis. Through intellectual analysis, one can come to faith in rebirth. And I've gone through this in Dhamma talks in the past, but not in a long time. So maybe it's time to do it again.
You can have a Sangha panel on this. We have favorite topics. And Sudha says, do you think the world is in consciousness, or is consciousness in the world?
I feel like this is one of those. I read this in like a sutta. Like, Venerable, does this come to mind?
Actually, I think it's just a false dichotomy, to be honest. It's
okay. So that phrasing is so interesting. But anyways,
yeah, and I don't remember a specific sutta where this question is asked.
But the phrase "world and conscious" or "conscious in the world," for some reason, anyways, it maybe.
Well, rather, I would ask a different question, which is, what is the world? And actually, the Buddha, there's a sutta where the Buddha does start with this exact question. He says, "What is the world?" So people say "world." What do they mean when they say "world"? And he answers his own question. He says, "Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. That's the world." So, and all of that is occurring within mind consciousness. So, sight consciousness, sound consciousness, and so on. So, in that sense, you can say that the world is an experience happening within consciousness. That's one way of talking. And in fact, there's the Vijnanavada school of thought in Buddhism, which maintains that ultimately there is only consciousness, there's only mind. That what we call the physical world is actually just mental phenomena occurring within the field of consciousness. And throughout Buddhist history, this has been regarded as one of the perfectly valid ways of conceptualizing experience.
Great. Thank you, Bante. And this is a great question for Tanjagaro. Vivek, our good friend, asks, I avoid killing, but unfortunately I live in an old building and there's often roaches around the house. I try to avoid killing, but it feels impossible not to kill them. What is your advice what to do?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, often when people take up Buddhism, they eventually decide, oh, I want to take on the 5 precepts, and then the reality of their living situation comes into being. They might be, like you said, this person's living in an old building. It's roach infested, and there's nothing to do. Couple things that come to mind. I mean, one that comes to mind is it's recognizing that it's very difficult sometimes to live in samsara. I mean, really, it's real. No, maybe a lot of time.
All the time.
All the time. They'll just cover the whole screen. It's not just dukkha, it's super dukkha.
It's dukkha that arises and never ceases.
Yeah, super dukkha, never. But no, this is hard. What you're and you're trying your best to deal with the situation, and then to just recognize that. I mean, it does sound like you try different things. I mean, if I were a lay person, I'm sure I would try lots of different things. And eventually you're like, wow, there's everything I've tried, and nothing's working. So one thing to do is, of course, you can always consider moving, and of course you will situation A, B, and C. But that should be on your mind. Like, okay, this is a situation. How can I start? If you're really think about, okay, this precept is really important to me. I really want to try. It's like you really kind of got to keep breaking this. Okay, like, do I want to still keep being in this situation? Is there something I can do? And that's something. That's one thing to just kind of bring up. It's not necessarily that you can move. Maybe there's lots of other reasons that come up, but just to bring it up, like, is it possible to move? Right? Is it possible to be in a different situation. Without knowing that initially it just is, you're going to be like, I can't do this, I have to take care of this person who lives here and they're not going to leave it. Whatever the reasons, but they keep bringing it up, right? Along with, I would also encourage you to so the first thing, of course, is making sure you understand that to basically bring compassion to yourself, right? Second thing is to see, can I get a situation? The third thing that comes to mind is to, and then this might be hard with roaches, but and especially, like I can imagine if I was like dealing with a roach situation, I'm trying all these different things. I'm trying, like, I don't know if there's even humane roach traps, probably isn't, Yeah, I'd be like maybe putting like breadcrumbs around, trying to like lead them outside. Of course, that's not going to work. There's going to come, they're just like everywhere, right? But I would be trying that. I'd be really frustrated. But like to try to, also bring up like, well, why did the Buddha put down this precept? And the Buddha put down this precept is because he's interested in your well-being and happiness, and he's interested in the well-being and happiness of others. Of course, in this case, roaches too, right? And seeing if you can, I don't know how to put this, like, like I would almost like see if I can like grab one of the roaches and put it in like a little box and make it, keep it as a pet. And I'm serious, and then the point of that is actually to, instead of looking at it as the roaches as a bunch of pests, is try to see if I can develop some, I don't know, some affection or some, looking at it as a being kind of worthy of love and care. We often do with, let's say, pets like cats and dogs and things like that. And I think this can help you navigate the situation. Again, I don't know your situation. I just imagine myself, a bunch of roaches. I might be really irritated with them. But that irritation actually can help, like, really kind of cripple our creativity of handling the situation. So hopefully that helps. Again, just to recap, first one, just bringing compassion to yourself. You're in a difficult situation. Two, is it, repeatedly, is it possible to change, get out of the situation? And three, see if you can develop a kinship with at least one of these roaches.
Great, thank you, Venerable. And Jason asks, are there any distinct differences in the path of practice for a layperson aiming at favorable rebirth versus full awakening?
So there's a lot of overlap in that both will make a strong effort to cultivate good karma through practicing generosity and morality. But one who is aiming at full awakening, first off, has the aspiration for full awakening. And so the Buddha speaks in many places in the suttas about the importance of aspiration. So if you do a meritorious act with the aspiration, may I be reborn in a pleasant place, then that act will lead to you being reborn in a pleasant place. But if you perform exactly the same meritorious action with the aspiration, may this good karma help to fuel me having supportive conditions for Dhamma practice, then that's the effect it will have. So a great example of this is the Sankharuppapatti Sutta, where the Buddha talks about how the thought that we have behind an action, like why we're doing what we're doing, our motivations can shape what kind of rebirth it fuels. So that's one difference, is the intention behind what we do. But also someone who's aiming at full awakening will generally, in addition to practicing dana and sila, they'll also tend to make an effort to cultivate samadhi and panya, because these are critical qualities for awakening, but are not critical qualities simply for a favorable rebirth. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Awesome, thank you, Venerable. And Anjan asks, I knew a lady whose husband and 2 adult sons were all schizophrenic. While her suffering only increased as she aged, her pain seemed permanent. How do we understand impermanence in this context? Tanjavero?
While her suffering only increased as she aged, her pain seemed permanent. So I'm gonna just apologize in advance. I have to infer certain things from what you're saying. It sounds like you know, a lady who as she was aging, it just seemed she was just like in constant pain. Is that your
I
venerable
think so,
understanding
because
of
of
Jesus?
the schizophrenic
Right.
members of the family.
How do you understand impermanence in this context? Sure. So I think maybe the question can be asking like, is it possible to use impermanence or Nietzsche to help with the situation? And I mean, on a basic level, I mean, this is one of those things where, you know, we all understand on a kind of simple practical level, at some point we age and we pass away. There's only so much, you know, life this existence. But I think maybe the question's more about like, it seemed like the days, there's just like this kind of extreme pain that was just constant, and then somehow they fall asleep and the same thing next day. So my, you know, I don't, John, I don't know if you've kind of, you know, and many people here probably practice meditation, or a good number of them. If you know, usually like when our experience can be a very painful overall experience, but if our sort of clarity is increased, our ability to be with the experience, that presence increase, what we'll tend to find is that that sense of kind of ever-presence pain is actually not quite what it seems. I mean, that there's that sense that there's ever-present pain, but when we actually look at the actual kind of raw experience, we actually might find is, oh, like and that's one of the reasons why body contemplation is so helpful. Usually, like when we're experiencing the body, it's not like uniformly over the body and like everything is just uniformly pain. Usually it's often, I don't know, my experience, it's often a relatively small localized area, or maybe several small localized areas, right? And if our mind gets clearer and clearer, but what you can see is that it actually has this pattern. It kind of, sometimes it pulses, it kind of vibrates. It doesn't, it's not, maybe it shifts, it goes from kind of one kind of, maybe like a dull thud to kind of a sharpness, and, and it kind of comes in and out. And so as that experience of meditating can actually help us see that kind of very direct experience of impermanence for Nietzsche, that before kind of had this sense of ever-presence pain, right? And then we get this, it's actually kind of coming in and out, and it's only in certain areas. And that can actually help us, those experiences can help us when we're relating to others, right? Because we can't meditate for others, right? But what we can do is we can be with that person. We might be able to help that person be with that experience, and maybe in a slightly different way. Because we'll know, like, this person, for example, may have this sense that everything is just, awful, but maybe there's a brief moments that there can be a bit of levity, or humor, or, we could, no matter how painful it is, we could always be with that person. That's compassion, right? So there's always ways of kind of helping others kind of, see a little bit things a little bit differently. But yeah, so I hope, your own experiences with meditation and Nietzsche can help you inform yourself as you're dealing with others. So,
awesome. Thank you, Venerable. That was great. And Rick asks, I have lived a life focused on being of love and service to others, but I have a difficult time receiving help or generosity. How can we grow in the Dhamma in this area? Well, first of all, I would say that it's a very important insight, the one that you had. So being aware of the situation, being aware that there's something that needs to be essentially developed. And how did you develop actually being of service to others? Through practice. So it's the same thing. When being the recipients of generosity, no excellence can be acquired without constant practice. So yeah, To a certain extent, it's very simple. You just need to endure the discomfort of actually being on the receiving end. We were talking precisely about that today, actually. I remember when I first ordained, even though I knew theoretically that, a lot of being in this form is like, receiving things. It was very difficult for me to be on the receiving end because similarly, I had a difficult time and I hadn't developed that skill set. So it felt like I was always like, kind of my birthday party. Growing up, I was born in the summer and like, it was like in Italy, if you live in the city, usually in the summer you go somewhere else outside of the city and you don't know anyone outside of the city because you're always in the city the rest of the year. So I was always celebrating rather other people were celebrating my birthday, and most of those people I did not know. And it was really awkward to be kind of like the center of attention and people giving you like the cake or whatever. And I was very shy growing up. And so I just hated the hell of it. I was like, oh, I can't wait for it to be over. I can't wait for it to be over. And at the very beginning, paradoxically, it was a little bit like this, being on the receiving end. I was like, oh, hate it. But also as a lay person, whenever people were giving me things, I was hating it. But as a lay person, sometimes we can avoid that and just just not receive most things and go like, oh, don't bother, oh, don't do that. But as a monastic, actually, if you don't bother giving me food, then you're going to starve and die. So you have to learn that. And as you practice, you get slightly better and better and better, and you start understanding that it's not necessarily that people are giving to you, that is the wholesome act. Perhaps we can have like, oh, I'm not worthy of all this generosity. I'm not, but we're actually, the act is worthy. And that is what Anumadana essentially is, that we are rejoicing in the fact that someone is cultivating that wholesome mind states. And if we like giving so much, we can understand how wholesome and how powerful and how beautiful and how sad it is actually when people prevent us from giving, how difficult, how like ugly that is. And we can kind of like, just start seeing things in a bit of a different way and go like, oh, it's really not about me, myself, and I, me receiving, me, the one taking the generosity, but rather it's like, it's about generosity, and generosity is good. And this is beautiful. And so we can, in Italian, we say, instead of thank you, we say grazie, which means grace. So I think that, I haven't researched it, but my intuition is that actually literally it means that you've been graced from God. Like it's like a gracious act of what something worth. It's very similar to Anumadana, I think. That's probably the origin, and it's very beautiful. So we see how there's a lot of wisdom into that. So we are at 9 p.m. But
Wow. So I think we're just gonna have to ask all of you who have unanswered questions, write them down and bring them next week. So we really want to give the full amount of time and attention to all of your questions, and we just don't have enough time right now to really do them justice. So please write down your questions and bring them next week, and we'll give them all the time and attention that they deserve.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And sorry for not being able today. We spoke a lot. But thank you again for asking all these great questions. And thanks to Bhante Sudaso and Tanjagaro for sharing the Dhamma. If you're around Empty Cloud Monastery, you're welcome to come every weekend at 6 p.m. for meditation and Dhamma talk, and every Sunday, well, the whole day, but from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. we have an afternoon of mindfulness, so you're welcome to join us for that. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu.